The wind howled across the Texas plains like a wounded animal, driving sheets of rain against the weathered wooden walls of Sarah Mitchell's homestead. Lightning split the darkened sky, illuminating the sparse landscape in brief, stark moments before plunging it back into darkness. Sarah sat by her small kitchen table, mending a torn work shirt by the flickering light of an oil lamp, the needle moving in steady, practiced motions through the coarse fabric. At 32, Sarah had grown accustomed to the solitude that had become her constant companion since Thomas's death 2 years ago. The tuberculosis had taken him slowly, leaving her with nothing but a modest ranch, a handful of cattle, and the stubborn determination that had seen her through the worst of frontier life. Her auburn hair, now streaked with premature grey from worry and hardship, was pulled back in a simple bun, and her hands bore the calluses and scars of a woman who had learned to survive on her own terms. The storm intensified, rattling the windows and sending rivulets of water through the gaps in the roof she hadn't yet found time to repair. Sarah set down her mending and moved to place a tin bucket beneath the largest leak, the metallic ping of raindrops creating an irregular rhythm in the small cabin. She had learned to find comfort in these sounds of home, however imperfect they might be. A sharp crack of thunder made her jump, followed immediately by what sounded like something heavy striking her front door. Sarah froze, listening intently. The horses in the small corral behind the house were restless, their nervous whinnying audible even over the storm. Another sound came, a low, pained groan that was unmistakably human. Sarah's heart began to race. Visitors were rare enough in good weather, and on a night like this, anyone out in the elements was either desperate or dangerous. She reached for the Winchester rifle that Thomas had taught her to use, checking to ensure it was loaded before approaching the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her chest. Only the storm answered, but then came another groan, weaker this time, followed by the sound of something sliding down the wooden door. Sarah hesitated for a long moment, weighing the risks. Finally, her inherent compassion overrode her caution. She lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door and pulled it open carefully, keeping the rifle ready. What she saw in the doorway made her gasp and nearly drop her weapon. A man lay crumpled against the doorframe, his long black hair plastered to his head by the rain, his bronze skin pale with pain and blood loss. He wore buckskin clothing and beaded decorations that immediately identified him as Comanche, the very people her neighbors spoke of with hatred and fear, the same warriors who had raided settlements throughout Texas for decades. The man was unconscious, a dark stain spreading across his shirt from a wound in his side. His breathing was shallow and labored, and in the lamplight, Sarah could see that he was burning with fever. For a moment, she stood paralyzed, torn between the ingrained fear of her community and the immediate need of a suffering human being before her. The practical part of her mind screamed warnings. Comanche warriors were dangerous, unpredictable, and helping one could bring terrible consequences. But as she looked at the wounded man, Sarah saw past the cultural divide to something more fundamental, a person in desperate need of help, no different from any injured soul who might collapse at her door. The storm seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was urging her to make a decision. Sarah glanced around the empty landscape, seeing no sign of other riders or warriors. She was truly alone with this choice, and something deep in her heart, the same compassion that had driven her to care for Thomas during his final illness, made the decision for her. Setting the rifle aside, Sarah knelt beside the unconscious warrior and checked his pulse. It was weak but steady. The bullet wound in his side was serious but not immediately fatal if treated properly. With considerable effort, she managed to drag him inside, his weight considerable despite his weakened state. She barred the door behind them and set about gathering the medical supplies she had learned to keep on hand for life on the frontier. As she worked to clean and dress his wound by lamplight, Sarah couldn't help but notice the intricate beadwork on his clothing, the careful craftsmanship that spoke of a rich culture she had never taken time to understand. His face, relaxed in unconsciousness, showed strength and character, with high cheekbones and features that would have been handsome under better circumstances. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small cabin, Sarah worked through the night to save the life of a man whose very presence could cost her everything she had left. Chapter 2. Crossing Lines. Dawn broke gray and subdued over the Texas landscape, the storm having passed but leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. Sarah had dozed fitfully in her chair beside the makeshift bed she had prepared on her kitchen floor, jolting awake every few minutes to check on her unexpected patient. The Comanche warrior, she had decided to think of him by what he was rather than what others feared him to be, had remained unconscious through the night, though his fever seemed to have broken shortly before sunrise. Sarah rose stiffly from her chair, her back aching from the uncomfortable position, and moved to stoke the fire in her small stove. The mundane act of preparing coffee helped calm her nerves as she considered the magnitude of what she had done. In her community, harboring a Comanche warrior would be seen as nothing short of treason. Clayton Briggs, the influential rancher who controlled much of the local politics and trade, had made his position clear on numerous occasions. The only good Indian was a dead Indian. As the coffee began to brew, Sarah heard a soft sound behind her and turned to find dark eyes watching her with a mixture of wariness and confusion. The warrior was awake, his gaze tracking her movements as she approached with a cup of water. He tried to sit up, wincing sharply as the movement pulled at his wound, and his hand instinctively moved toward where his weapons should have been. "Easy," Sarah said softly, holding up her hands in a gesture she hoped he would understand as peaceful. "You're hurt. I helped you." The warrior's eyes never left her face as he struggled to make sense of his situation. He spoke in his native language, his voice rough with pain and dehydration, the words flowing in patterns that Sarah found strangely musical, despite her inability to understand them. When she shook her head apologetically, he fell silent, clearly trying to piece together how he had come to be in a white woman's cabin. Sarah knelt beside him, offering the cup of water. After a moment's hesitation, he accepted it, drinking carefully but gratefully. She could see him studying her face, perhaps trying to determine whether she posed a threat or represented some kind of trap. The intelligence in his dark eyes was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself wondering about his life, his family, the circumstances that had brought him wounded to her door. "My name is Sarah," she said, pointing to herself. Then, feeling somewhat foolish, but determined to establish some form of communication, she pointed to him and raised her eyebrows questioningly. The warrior studied her for a long moment before responding. "Ayana," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for her to understand that this was his name. "Ayana," Sarah repeated, and she saw something that might have been surprise flicker across his features at her careful pronunciation. The name was beautiful, she thought, far more so than the harsh epithets she had heard used to describe his people. As the morning progressed, Sarah went about her daily chores with one eye always on her patient. Ayana watched her movements with the alertness of a man accustomed to danger, but gradually she sensed his wariness beginning to ease. When she changed his bandages, he bore the pain stoically, though she could see the effort it cost him. By midday, he was able to sit up against the wall, and Sarah had managed to get him to drink some broth. Their communication remained limited to gestures and the few words they had exchanged, but something resembling trust was beginning to develop between them. Sarah found herself thinking of him not as a faceless enemy, but as an individual, a man who had been hurt and was far from his own people. It was then that she heard the sound that made her blood run cold, the thunder of approaching horses. Sarah rushed to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. Her heart sank as she recognized Clayton Briggs, leading a group of 6 men, all armed, and riding with the purposeful intensity of a hunting party. Ayana heard the horses too, and despite his weakness, he struggled to rise. Sarah turned to him, her mind racing. In that moment, she realized that her choice the night before had been only the beginning. Now she faced a far more difficult decision. Would she stand by her act of compassion, or would she save herself by turning Ayana over to men who would surely kill him? The riders were close enough now that she could hear Briggs shouting orders. Sarah looked at Ayana, who met her gaze with dignity despite his vulnerable position. In his eyes, she saw no plea for mercy, no expectation of salvation, only a quiet acceptance of whatever fate awaited him. But Sarah Mitchell had not survived 2 years alone on the frontier by abandoning her principles when they became inconvenient. Whatever the cost, she would not betray the trust of a man she had chosen to save. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. The pounding of hooves grew louder as Clayton Briggs and his men approached the homestead. Sarah's mind raced as she considered her options, each one seeming more dangerous than the last. Ayana struggled to stand, his warrior's instincts telling him to face whatever came with dignity, but Sarah placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Stay down," she whispered urgently, then pointed toward a small root cellar beneath a loose floorboard near the back wall. It was barely large enough for a person, used mainly for storing preserves, but it might provide concealment. Ayana understood immediately, and, despite his obvious pain, began moving toward the hiding place. The riders pulled up outside with a thunder of hooves and shouting voices. Sarah helped Ayana into the cramped space beneath the floor, their eyes meeting briefly as she replaced the board. In that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected, gratitude mixed with a deep concern for her safety. It struck her that he understood the risk she was taking far better than she had initially realized. "Sarah Mitchell!" Clayton Briggs's voice boomed across the yard, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to talk." Sarah smoothed her dress, checked her appearance in the small mirror by the door, and stepped outside onto her modest porch. Briggs sat his horse like a conqueror, his silver hair gleaming beneath his wide-brimmed hat, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating. The men with him were a mixture of his ranch hands and townspeople, all armed and clearly agitated. "Mr. Briggs," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady, "what brings you out so early after such a terrible storm?" "You know damn well what brings us here," Briggs replied, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "We tracked a wounded Comanche brave to your door. His blood trail leads right up to your front step." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't know what you're talking about. The storm last night was fierce. Perhaps the rain washed away whatever you think you saw." Briggs stepped closer, his spurs jingling softly in the morning silence. Behind him his men remained mounted but ready, their hands resting on their weapons. "Don't play games with me, Sarah. We know he made it this far. The question is whether you've seen him." "I've seen no one," Sarah replied firmly. "I was alone all night, mending clothes and waiting for the storm to pass." Tom Crawford, one of Briggs's ranch foremen, leaned forward in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should search the place. If she's hiding him." "She wouldn't be that foolish," Briggs interrupted, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. "Would you, Sarah? You wouldn't risk everything you have left for some savage who'd slit your throat the moment you turned your back." The casual cruelty in his words made Sarah's jaw tighten, but she maintained her composure. "As I said, I've seen no one. Perhaps your wounded man found shelter elsewhere, or perhaps he didn't survive the storm at all." Briggs studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes searching for any sign of deception. Sarah had dealt with this man before. He had tried to buy her land after Thomas's death, offering a fraction of its worth, and becoming increasingly persistent when she refused. She knew he was intelligent, ruthless, and not easily fooled. "Mind if we water our horses?" Briggs asked, though it wasn't really a question. "It's been a long ride." Sarah nodded, knowing she had little choice. As the men led their horses to her small well, she remained on the porch, acutely aware that Ayana lay hidden just yards away beneath her kitchen floor. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, the low murmur of conversation among the riders. "You know, Sarah," Briggs said conversationally as he approached the porch, "living out here alone isn't safe for a woman, especially with Comanche raiders still active in the area. You should consider my offer again. I'd pay you fair market value for this place, and you could move into town where you'd be protected." "I can protect myself," Sarah replied, "and this is my home. Is it worth dying for?" The question was asked quietly, but the threat was unmistakable, because that's what'll happen if you keep harboring enemies of civilization. The Comanche don't distinguish between those who help them and those who fight them. To them, we're all the same. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm not harboring anyone, Mr. Briggs, and I'm not selling my land." One of the men called out from near the corral, "Mr. Briggs, you need to see this." Sarah's blood chilled as she saw the man kneeling near her back door, examining something on the ground. Briggs strode over and Sarah was forced to follow, her mind racing. The man was pointing to dark stains in the mud, bloodstains that the rain hadn't completely washed away. "Fresh blood," the man announced, "and it leads right to the door." Briggs turned to Sarah with a cold smile. "Still going to tell me you haven't seen anyone?" Sarah's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to speak. I butchered a chicken yesterday afternoon, before the storm. The blood must be from that." "Awful lot of blood for one chicken," Tom Crawford observed suspiciously. "It was a large rooster," Sarah replied quickly, "and I'm not very practiced at butchering. It was messy." Briggs studied the bloodstains, then looked back at Sarah. She could see him weighing her explanation, trying to decide whether it was plausible. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Finally, Briggs straightened. "I think we need to take a look inside your house, Sarah, just to satisfy our curiosity." It wasn't a request, and Sarah knew it. Her heart sank as she realized that her deception had reached its limit. In moments, they would discover Ayana, and both their lives would be forfeit. But as she looked at the hard faces surrounding her, Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "No," she said quietly. "This is my home, and you have no right to search it." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah saw several of the men exchange glances. Briggs's expression darkened, and she knew that her refusal had confirmed his suspicions. "I'm afraid I disagree," he said, stepping toward the door. Chapter 4. The Stand. Sarah moved quickly to block the doorway, her slight frame dwarfed by Briggs's imposing presence, but her resolve unwavering. "You'll have to go through me first." The tension in the yard became palpable as the armed men shifted uneasily in their saddles. This was no longer a simple search for a wounded warrior. It had become a confrontation between two strong-willed individuals, with the lives of both Sarah and Ayana hanging in the balance. "Sarah," Briggs said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "you're making a serious mistake. Step aside." "This is my property," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. "And you have no legal authority to enter my home without cause." Tom Crawford laughed harshly. "Legal authority? Woman, we're the only law out here, and harboring Comanche makes you an enemy combatant. I've told you repeatedly, I'm not harboring anyone." Sarah's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "And even if I were, since when do we condemn people without trial in this country? Since those savages started scalping women and children," another rider called out, his voice filled with bitter hatred. "My brother's family was wiped out in a raid last spring. Every last one of them butchered." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for the man's loss, but she couldn't let emotion override her principles. "I'm sorry for your family's tragedy, but that doesn't give you the right to murder an injured man without knowing his crimes." "His crime is being Comanche," Briggs said flatly. "That's enough." The standoff continued, with Sarah blocking the door and Briggs just feet away, his men growing increasingly restless behind him. Sarah could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. She knew she couldn't physically prevent them from entering if they chose to use force, but she hoped that her defiance might give them pause. Inside the house, Ayana lay in the cramped root cellar, listening to every word of the confrontation above. Even with his limited English, he understood enough to know that Sarah was risking her life to protect him. The knowledge filled him with a mixture of gratitude and anguish. This brave woman was about to pay the ultimate price for her compassion, and there was nothing he could do to help her. "Last chance, Sarah," Briggs said, his patience clearly exhausted. "Step aside or we'll move you aside." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of any argument that might sway these men. Then inspiration struck. "If you enter my home by force, Mr. Briggs, I'll report it to the territorial authorities. Judge Morrison in Austin won't look kindly on armed men breaking into a widow's home without cause." Briggs paused, and Sarah saw uncertainty flicker across his features. Judge Morrison was known for his strict interpretation of the law, and Briggs's political ambitions could be damaged by reports of illegal conduct. "You're bluffing," he said, but with less conviction than before. "Am I?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Are you willing to risk your reputation and your business interests on that assumption?" For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then Tom Crawford spoke up from his horse. "Boss, what if she's telling the truth about the chicken? Maybe we're wasting time here while the real trail goes cold." Briggs glanced around at his men, clearly weighing his options. Sarah held her breath, knowing that this moment would determine whether she and Ayana lived or died. "There were other tracks," one of the younger riders offered hesitantly, "leading north toward the creek. Maybe the Comanche kept moving." Sarah saw the doubt creeping into Briggs's expression and pressed her advantage. "The storm would have made travel difficult for an injured man. If he was as badly wounded as you believe, he might have taken shelter anywhere. An old barn, a cave, even under an overhang." Briggs stared at her for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. Finally, Briggs stepped back. "Mount up," he called to his men. "We'll check the other possible shelter spots." As the riders prepared to leave, Briggs moved close to Sarah one final time. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice carrying a personal menace that made her blood run cold. "I know you're hiding something, and I will find out what it is." "I'm sure you'll do whatever you think is necessary," Sarah replied, refusing to be intimidated. Briggs mounted his horse with fluid grace, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. "Remember what I said about this being dangerous country for a woman alone. Accidents happen out here all the time." With that barely veiled threat, he spurred his horse forward, and the group rode away in a cloud of dust. Sarah remained on her porch until they disappeared over a distant rise, then finally allowed herself to collapse against the doorframe, her legs suddenly weak with relief. She had won this round, but at what cost? Briggs's parting words made it clear that she had made a powerful enemy, and in the isolated world of the Texas frontier, that could prove fatal. Moreover, she now had to figure out what to do with Ayanna once he recovered enough to travel. Going back inside, Sarah carefully lifted the floorboard to reveal Ayanna looking up at her, with an expression of profound gratitude and concern. Even in his weakened state, she could see that he understood the magnitude of what had just transpired. "Ayanna," she said softly, helping him back to his makeshift bed. "You're safe for now." But as she looked into his dark eyes, Sarah wondered if either of them would truly be safe ever again. Chapter 5. The Price of Courage. 3 days passed in an uneasy calm that Sarah knew was deceptive. Ayanna's strength had returned remarkably quickly, aided by the natural resilience of a man accustomed to hardship and his own knowledge of healing herbs that he had gestured for her to gather from the surrounding prairie. Their communication had evolved beyond simple words into a complex system of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the gradual sharing of vocabulary from both languages. Sarah learned that Ayanna meant eternal blossom in his tongue, and that he was not a raider, but a scout who had been tracking a group of cattle thieves, white men who had been stealing horses and blaming the thefts on Comanche bands. He had been shot while gathering evidence of their crimes, evidence that could have prevented future conflicts between his people and the settlers. In return, Sarah shared her own story, her journey west with Thomas, their dreams of building a life together, and the loneliness that had followed his death. She found herself talking more in these few days than she had in months, discovering in Ayanna an unexpectedly good listener despite the language barrier. It was on the 4th morning that everything changed. Sarah was tending her small vegetable garden behind the house, while Ayanna rested inside, still regaining his full strength, when she heard the sound of a single horse approaching. Her blood chilled as she recognized the rider. Tom Crawford, alone this time, but still armed. Crawford dismounted slowly, his weathered face grim. "Morning, Mrs. Mitchell." "Mr. Crawford," Sarah replied warily, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you out here?" "Conscience, I suppose," he said, surprising her with his honesty. "Mr. Briggs sent me to keep an eye on your place, see if anyone visits." Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped that Briggs's departure meant the end of their surveillance, but clearly she had underestimated his persistence. Crawford removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Ma'am, I've been watching this place for 2 days now, and I've seen things that don't add up. Smoke from your chimney at odd hours, 2 sets of footprints around your well, and—" He paused, clearly struggling with something. "And I heard you talking to someone yesterday evening. Someone who wasn't speaking English." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her, but she maintained her composure. "I sometimes talk to myself, Mr. Crawford. It helps with the loneliness." "In Comanche?" Crawford's eyes were sad rather than accusatory. "Mrs. Mitchell, I know you're hiding that wounded warrior. The question is, what am I going to do about it?" Sarah studied the man before her. Tom Crawford had worked for Briggs for nearly a decade, but he had a reputation for fairness and had never been known for cruelty. Unlike his employer, Crawford had a family, a wife and 3 children in town, and Sarah sensed that this assignment troubled him. "What do you want me to say?" Sarah asked quietly. Crawford sighed heavily. "The truth, I suppose. I'm tired of lies and half-truths." After a long moment, Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives. "He's inside, wounded but recovering. His name is Ayanna, and he's not a raider. He was tracking white cattle thieves when he was shot." Crawford nodded slowly as if he had expected this confirmation. "I figured as much. Mind if I meet him?" Sarah blinked in surprise. This was not the reaction she had anticipated. You want to meet him? Mrs. Mitchell, I've been thinking a lot these past few days about what's right and what's legal, and I'm not sure they're the same thing anymore. Crawford's voice carried a weariness that spoke of inner conflict. My oldest boy is about the age your Comanche would have been when he learned to ride. Makes a man think about the human cost of all this hatred. Hesitantly, Sarah led Crawford inside, where Ayanna sat by the window, clearly having heard their conversation, despite understanding only parts of it. The two men studied each other for a long moment. One, a weathered cowboy with the dust of countless cattle drives in his clothes, the other a Comanche warrior far from his people and still bearing the marks of recent injury. Crawford removed his hat respectfully. Ayanna, he said carefully, attempting to pronounce the name as Sarah had taught him. Ayanna nodded gravely, recognizing the gesture of respect. He spoke briefly in his own language, then gestured toward Crawford and said, "Friend?" "He's asking if you're a friend," Sarah translated. Crawford considered this for a moment, then extended his hand toward Ayanna. "I'd like to be." The handshake that followed was brief but significant, representing a bridge across a divide that had seemed insurmountable just days before. Crawford spent the next hour listening as Sarah translated Ayanna's account of tracking the cattle thieves, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. "Those men he's describing," Crawford said finally, "I think I know who they are. Jake Hartwell and his bunch. They've been operating out of the Badlands for months, but Briggs has been convinced it was Indian raids." The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the small cabin. If Ayanna was telling the truth, and Crawford found himself believing the warrior's straightforward account, then innocent Comanche bands had been blamed for crimes committed by white outlaws. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Crawford was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the vast Texas landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was resolute. "Now we do what's right, regardless of the consequences." Over the next several hours, Crawford helped Sarah and Ayanna develop a plan. Ayanna would return to his people with evidence of the real cattle thieves, while Sarah would face whatever retribution Briggs might devise. But Crawford had a different idea. He would go to Judge Morrison himself with the truth, risking his job and possibly his safety to ensure that justice was served. As evening approached and the time came for farewells, Sarah found herself unexpectedly emotional. In just a few days, Ayanna had become more than a patient or a refugee. He had become a friend who had challenged her assumptions about his people and shown her a different perspective on the conflicts tearing through the frontier. Ayanna approached her as Crawford prepared the horses, speaking in English words he had been practicing. "Sarah Mitchell," he said carefully. "Good. Heart. Ayanna. Remember." He reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small, intricately carved bone amulet depicting a flowering plant. "Ayanna flower," he said, placing it gently in her hands. "For eternal blossom woman." Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes as she accepted the gift. In return, she gave him a small leather pouch containing the gold wedding ring Thomas had given her, not because she no longer treasured it, but because she knew Ayanna would understand its value and the trust it represented. As the two men rode away into the gathering darkness, Crawford to town and his uncertain future, Ayanna toward his people and the hope of preventing further bloodshed, Sarah stood alone on her porch once again. But she no longer felt the crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion for 2 years. Clayton Briggs would undoubtedly discover Crawford's betrayal and her role in it. There would be consequences, perhaps severe ones. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah Mitchell felt truly alive, connected to something larger than her own survival. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite that fear. And in a small way, she had helped bridge the gap between two peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies rather than human beings. The Texas night settled around her homestead like a familiar blanket, filled with the same sounds and scents she had known for years, but everything had changed. Sarah Mitchell was no longer just a woman surviving alone on the frontier. She was someone who had chosen compassion over fear, and that choice had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of others as well. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would not face it with the same person she had been just a week before. She had discovered that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting one's enemies, but in recognizing their humanity, and in that recognition, finding the path to a different kind of victory altogether.